Good afternoon and good evening, everyone. My name is Dewana Nicole with Advancement Project, and I just want to thank you for joining our webinar today on whole school implementation of restorative justice, creating staff buy-in and ownership. And with me on the phone is Allison Meyer, who is formerly with the Denver School-Based Restorative Practices Partnership, but is now with Denver Public Schools. Before we get started, I do want everyone to know that this webinar is being recorded. So we like to do these in the spirit of a circle. And so before we get into the agenda and a little bit about the partnership, Allison is going to do an opening ceremony for us.
Thank you, Joanna. So this reading is from a book called 365 Tao. And for every day of the year, there is a Taoist teaching followed by a reflection. And this one is called Illumination. Fire feeding on fire. Everyone understands that burning wood produces fire. But when fire feeds on fire, that is a rare condition that yields the greatest illumination. Two flames come together and yield light more magnificent than either could have given forth alone. In the case of community activity, this means that when one cooperates with others, the accomplishments are greater than what individuals can do on their own. Such a situation requires a harmony that will generate ideas, inspiration, as well as momentum for growth and action. If the combinations occur properly, the results will be like fire upon fire and will illuminate the world. Sometimes the combination comes down to just two people. If two people join forces, neither sacrificing their individuality, but only lending their power to an endeavor, there will be a wonderful situation that will both benefit others and encourage greater growth in the two people as well. Fire feeding on fire can also mean the swift exhaustion of all energies involved. One must be careful not to lose one's own personality in any joining. The idea is integration, not assimilation. No matter what can be achieved in joining with others, it is wise to remember that we each walk this path independently. The ultimate truth is the journey, and its final rewards are still for each of us to face alone.
Thank you so much, Allison.
Thank you.
So this webinar is being brought to you by the Denver School-Based Restorative Practices Partnership. It's a coalition of 5 organizations, the Youth and Parent Organizing Group, Padres y Jóvenes Unidos, Denver Public Schools, Denver Classroom Teachers Association, which is the local teachers union, the National Education Association, which is the nation's largest teachers union, and to which DCTA is an affiliate, and Advancement Project, Civil Rights Racial Justice Organization. We started this partnership a few years ago with the hope of both building out restorative practices within Denver Public Schools and then also having Denver Public Schools serve as a model for schools and school districts nationally who were looking to implement restorative justice. And so at the local level in Denver, we have 3 model schools that mentor schools that are just beginning their restorative practices journey. And then at the national level, we produce resources like the implementation guide that we're going to talk about tonight. And also we have monthly visits where anybody from across the country can come into Denver and spend a day with one of our 3 model schools. And so what we're going to be talking about today, creating staff buy-in and ownership, is one of the benchmarks of a guide that we just released at the end of August, School-Wide Restorative Practices Step by Step, which provides educators, community members, families, and students with a rubric on how to implement restorative practices in your school communities. Just one note, in Denver Public Schools, they use the word restorative practices. At the national level, we use the word restorative justice, so you'll hear both mentioned on the call. We've tried to be pretty consistent by using restorative justice practices most of the time, but if you hear a difference, that's the reason why. So today, Allison is going to walk us through a way to create staff buy-in and ownership in your school community. Afterwards, we will take some question and answers, and we'll talk more about that when we get to that point. But in order to do that, you could either type in a question, which you can do online, or you can raise your hand and I can unmute you. That takes a little bit of time, so just please bear with us. Or you can also type into the chat and we can answer your question that way. So right now I am going to turn it over to Allison.
Thanks, Joanna. So before we even jump into this, I just wanted to talk a little bit about why Denver in particular has been focusing on staff buy-in and ownership, and then also just why we use that terminology. Originally, when our partnership first launched a report about 2 years ago, we were using simply the term staff buy-in to talk about how do we get this to live not just within one person in a building, but among all of the people in a building that interact with students on a regular basis. And our local union, DCTA, actually really pushed us to also include the term ownership, because it's not just that we want our staff bought into restorative practices and the philosophy of restorative practices, but we want them to own a lot of pieces of that work as well. And then just why this has been particularly of importance to Denver Public Schools. 10 or 12 years ago, when Denver Public Schools first started piloting restorative practices in buildings, one thing that they were doing is using grant funding to take coordinators and put them into an individual building to be the restorative person. And while they saw some success with this, namely in a reduction of suspensions and expulsions in the schools, one thing they saw is that that person still had an endless line of students that were standing outside of their office that had been referred to them by their teachers. And so what they really saw was that restorative practices was being used as an alternative to suspension or as an alternative to expulsion, but the practices like the preventative work wasn't ever really living in the classroom. And so I'm actually working with a small cohort of schools in Denver right now, and we've been gathering once a month and kind of talking about, you know, different aspects of restorative practices implementation. And this is why we actually chose to talk about staff buy-in and ownership with them first. When Denver originally implemented it, really did end up living in one person in one office in each of the schools that had a restorative practices coordinator. And so we're really hoping that as the district looks to expand their implementation, they can really empower educators in the school buildings to really own this work. So for those of you that are following along with your implementation guides, on page 6 is a list of what we think about as the implementation benchmarks. What do you actually have to have happening in your school in order to say that we do restorative justice practices school-wide? And so this presentation specifically relates to benchmark 1 and benchmark 4. So first of all, we want to make sure that there's a common understanding of why restorative justice practices are being implemented in a building. And that both includes just like understanding why suspensions don't work and expulsions don't work, but also understanding some of the long-term consequences of those exclusionary discipline practices and understanding how students of color are disproportionately impacted by exclusionary discipline practices. And it also relates to benchmark 4, which is making sure that all educators, both new and returning, are trained in restorative justice practices. And I'll talk a little bit more about like how it's not just a one and done training, how that can be ongoing and intensive, and how you can continue to find ways to refine and retune educators' practices within a building. And so before we talk about how to get staff buy-in and ownership of restorative justice practices, I wanted to first take a minute to kind of look at what that might look like in a school building. And so as we walk through these, you might want to think about your own school community and how you feel you do on each one of these indicators of staff buy-in and ownership. Another note I wanted to talk about is when I'm using the term educator, I'm talking about any adult in a building that interacts with students. And so when we talk about educators, we're including cafeteria workers, paraprofessionals, bus drivers. Maybe if you're in a larger district, you have an adult from the district that sometimes comes to support in your building. Ideally, all of these people will have that vision for restorative practices and also have some of the basic trainings of restorative practices as well. And a second note, you'll notice for each of these bullet points, I say most educators and not all educators. And that's for a couple of reasons. One, I think trying to achieve 100% staff buy-in is very ambitious, and it's certainly something we can reach for. But the reality is that most schools aren't going to have 100% buy-in, or at least not have 100% buy-in in every situation from every teacher on every day. And so I can speak from my own experiences as a classroom teacher. I might, looking at that first bullet point, I might be willing to participate in restorative professional development most days. But if I'm having a really hard day and I've been having some really tough conflicts with one of my students, maybe one afternoon I'm not completely bought into that work. And so that's why we talk about most and not all. And really the goal is that anybody who isn't bought in on that day or just in general, as long as they're not actively undermining the work that you're doing in your building, it might be okay for them to be there. And so when we think about staff buy-in and ownership of restorative practices, one thing we want to talk about is, first of all, that for the most part, your staff, the educators in your building, are willing to participate in restorative professional development. And as we know, restorative professional development should include role-playing, and I think that's kind of a tricky place where we get a lot of staff members to kind of check out. And it's a really good measure to see how engaged your staff is. Someone who's really engaged in this work is going to understand the benefit of practicing having restorative conversations with students or using effective statements. The second indicator we've been thinking about here in Denver is that most educators work to build relationships through the use of circles or other proactive restorative justice practices. We want to make sure that restorative practices isn't what Denver Public Schools, for example, originally piloted 10 years ago, where it's just an alternative to a suspension or just the alternative to an office referral. We want to make sure that it isn't just in reaction to student behavior, but it's a conscious effort to build relationships and to build community. And as a piece of that, I would say that the educators themselves need to be willing to engage in that relationship building. And so it can't just be among students. It has to include the educator that's either in a specific classroom or a paraprofessional or a support staff member. The third indicator is that most educators engage in restorative dialogue and are willing to take responsibility for their role in interactions with fellow staff, families, and students. I think we see in a lot of schools here in Denver where they might think they're implementing restorative practices, but there are some small areas where they're lacking. Through observation and coaching, we've started to understand that maybe the teacher is using those restorative questions, but when it gets to the part about what part can you take responsibility for, they're never willing to take any of that responsibility. And so for a staff to really show that they're bought in, and for an individual educator to show that they're bought into restorative practices and they own that practice, they also have to be willing to own their behavior. I think another important piece with that indicator too is that they're willing to own their behavior in interactions with staff members, in interactions with families, and interactions with students. We see in a lot of schools that restorative practices become something that is done to students. And that's really that's where this indicator what this indicator really talks about is how do we make sure that all members of the school community have access to using restorative practices. The next indicator is that most educators maintain a growth mindset that emphasizes improvement over accomplishment and views students and staff member behavior as amenable to change. One thing that really speaks to me about this from my experiences as a classroom teacher is if I just remember some of the times we're sitting in a teacher's lounge, for example, and sometimes how there can be a very toxic environment and toxic language being used to talk about some of our students or to talk about fellow staff members or even some of the families. And so how do we make sure that the proper language is being used and that people have that mindset of, this kid isn't bad, maybe some behavior that they did is disrupting the learning environment, but they have the potential to be able to change, and we just need to be working with them throughout that process. The next indicator is that most educators trust the restorative process to hold individuals accountable to their behavior and to repair community when harm has been caused. I think a lot of us are probably familiar with this form of pushback of, there's just a conversation. There's not a harsh enough consequence. And I think that shows in a lot of ways that your staff might not be fully bought in, and they could probably use some additional supports in understanding why this is really being implemented and what the purpose of restorative practices is. And then that final item is that most educators understand that when implemented with a race-conscious lens, the use of restorative justice practices can reduce racial disparities in discipline. One reason why we added in this piece, when implemented with a race-conscious lens, is what we've seen overall in Denver is there's been a dramatic decrease in suspensions and expulsions and referrals to police across the district. But the racial disparities have continued to persist, particularly for our Black students here in Denver. And so we always want to add in that you can't just implement restorative justice practices and expect that the racial disparities go away. One of our research partners always tells me restorative justice practices have to work better for students of color, or the racial disparities will persist even if things get better across the board for most students in Denver. And so in order for your staff to truly be bought in and to own this work, they have to understand those long-term implications of not implementing restorative justice practices or not implementing restorative justice practices with that race-conscious lens. And so when we're talking about staff buy-in and ownership, this is really what we're talking about. Is your staff really understanding of the implications of using punitive discipline policies? Are they trusting in the process of restorative practices to actually be able to build community and to address conflict and behavior within the building? How are they talking about their students and their families and other staff members? And are we using these practices for both the adults and the students in our school communities? And so we're going to shift gears now and talk about, if this is the dream, if this is what we want staff buy-in and ownership of restorative justice practices to look like, how do we actually get there? And so the answer I always give is, first of all, intentionally. One thing we hear happen in a lot of school buildings is they kind of hope that if we just start doing it with some kids, hopefully it will catch on. And I think there is a small piece of truth to that, but I think there are systems and structures and practices that you can develop that will make that shift a lot quicker and a lot more powerful. And so as we kind of walk through this webinar today, we're going to kind of group the different strategies for getting staff buy-in and ownership into 5 different categories. And so those categories are: 1, by building skills within our educators; 2, by providing educators the time and resources to practice; 3, by promoting educator self-care; 4, by providing educators the time and space to discuss challenges and share ideas; and then finally 5, by highlighting success stories. And so we'll talk through each one of these categories and give you some ideas of what we've seen some schools in Denver or across the country do to really make sure that they're intentionally gaining staff buy-in and ownership as they work to get school-wide implementation. And so first I wanted to talk about just skill building within our educators. If you are following along in our implementation guide, you can look at pages 36 and 37 in the guide, which specifically speak to the professional development that you can provide to all of the educators in your building. One of the first things that we find is really important is that educators need to understand why this shift is happening. And there's a couple ways you can have this conversation, and probably a couple ways you should have this conversation so that staff see it from various perspectives. But first, it could be really helpful, one, to look at just why punitive discipline doesn't work and isn't an effective intervention. You might also examine disaggregated discipline data. That might be disaggregated by race, by gender, by English language learner status, by special education status, to really see which groups of students are being particularly targeted by punitive discipline practices. You might read articles that show the impact of restorative justice practices compared to punitive discipline practices. You might talk a lot, like you might use a very strong equity lens when you're talking about this work, especially because we really want our educators to understand how punitive discipline practices disproportionately impact our students of color. Another category of skill building you might want to explore in your building is proactive restorative justice practices. So that might be circle keeping. It might also be adding a restorative lens to how teachers structure their lesson plans or how they develop classroom rules. I think a lot of times we just expect these things to happen, but some of our our teachers haven't gone through programming that might support them in doing this work. I can speak to my own experiences as an educator here. I attended a 4-year undergraduate program to get a bachelor's in education, and in those 4 years, the only classroom management or culture building advice that I got was not to smile until after November. And so I think a lot of our educators are walking into the classroom and they might have some tools for instruction, but a lot of our educators are not walking into the classroom having tools for how to build relationships with students. And so that is a skill that can be taught and should be taught in our schools. We also want to make sure, obviously, that we're teaching some of the practices themselves, and specifically those that could be used as a classroom management tool for our teachers. So one thing that here in Denver we make sure that we teach our classroom teachers is how to use restorative dialogue. And this is a great skill that shouldn't just be taught to certified staff, but also paraprofessionals, cafeteria workers, bus drivers, of how do you have that conversation with students so they can understand what happened in this situation, what the impact was on the community, what part that they can take responsibility for, and how can they fix it. And I think it's really important here too to also mention that like this should be used for adult to adult conflict within a building as well if you really want to talk about having school-wide implementation. And then I think there's a lot of professional development that could be complementary to restorative practices or supplementary to restorative practices. And so that would include implicit bias training, anti-racism training, talking about trauma-informed care and how to create trauma-informed spaces for our students, other social-emotional curriculums. You might see like a character building curriculum or some sort of character strengths curriculum. Here in Denver, we use the parent-teacher home visit program, which has seen a lot of success in reaching out to families that might otherwise be disengaged with working with the school community. And so just to give an example, through that program, teachers are encouraged to go to in a team, so with another partner teacher, to go and visit a student's home and to spend that time not addressing something negative that happened in the classroom or happened at school. This isn't a time to express concerns. It's really just a time to get to know the student's family. And that way, if there ever is a concern, it really makes reaching out to that family a lot easier. And then we also see a lot of PBIS training that can be complementary PD. One thing I do caution against here is I think it's imperative if you're using any of these complementary professional developments to explicitly say, how does this connect to restorative practices when you're delivering the training to your staff? I think so often restorative justice practices can feel like something that's added to a staff member's plate. We're really kind of shifted to talking about like this is just a lens that we're now seeing everything we do in this building, and this is the mindset that this school is taking on. And so making sure it's really clear, how does this PD really connect to restorative justice practices? So once you've trained your staff, I think it's really important to make sure that they still have this time and the resources to practice. One thing restorative practices asks of our educators is for them to give our students, in a lot of cases, the time and space to practice these new social emotional skills and conflict resolution skills that they're working on. And I think we need to do the same for our educators. And so there's a couple ideas of what that might look like. First of all, you might want to try doing some non-evaluative coaching on restorative justice practices. A lot of times we find that even just sending in the classroom teacher's regular evaluator kind of like shuts them down a little bit, makes them nervous and anxious. And so sometimes it's better to even send somebody in the building that is in no way connected to evaluation or to coaching around instruction, and somebody who can just go and sit in the back of the room and give feedback on, you know, I really think that your tone is doing a really great job keeping students calm. I really liked the way your body language really communicated to students that you wanted to be on their level. One thing we've seen as really productive for giving, like, again, this time and the resources to practice these new skills has been providing teachers with prompting questions and sentence stems for having constructive conversations, namely about students of concern. And I'll go back to my teacher's lounge example here. I've seen some schools that have started to post in their teacher's lounge some sentence stems for teachers to use when they're talking about their students. And just in a way to make sure, like, are we using that growth mindset and that asset-based language when we're talking about students of concern? I think one thing we've seen a lot of success in here in Denver, and I guess it's in response to where we see pushback sometimes from classroom teachers. I think we all know that our teachers are very overwhelmed and a lot of times feel very under pressure, particularly in a turnaround school where the teacher might feel a lot of pressure to make sure that the math scores are going up by so many points. And so what we saw in a couple of school buildings, and I'm speaking about one elementary school in particular, is they were getting a lot of pushback from teachers around, like, when am I supposed to actually find the time to run these community building circles in my classroom? You know, and if my district evaluator popped in on that day, what would my LEAP evaluation, that's the framework that DPS uses for evaluating teachers, what kind of scores would I get if that's what they were seeing? And so their principal heard that concern and instead restructured their bell schedule to include 20 minutes at the beginning of the day that was protected circle time. And so that not only gave the educators like a set time where they didn't feel like an evaluator was going to pop in or anything like that, but it also allowed the administration to really hold teachers accountable to using that time to running morning circles. And I think the last thing we need to remember to provide our educators is when you're first starting to learn this, you also might need support and it might not work the first time. And so there need to be clear systems to refer students or families or staff members to the restorative process when an in-class intervention has not been successful. And we need to allow room and allow this learning curve so that our teachers don't feel like all the resources have been taken away from them, but that this is just a new tool that's added to their toolbox in order to manage their classrooms and to build relationships with their students. And so next I wanted to talk about educator self-care. I think it's really important to remember that we cannot expect our educators to take care of our students in this way if they don't feel like they're being cared for as well. And so we highly encourage that you use restorative justice practices with your staff. And that could look a couple different ways. That might be in reaction to a conflict among staff. And that could also just be regular community building. One of the schools that I'm working with recently started hosting staff circles after school once a week, and they're seeing a lot of interest, and they're also seeing that that's translating into the teachers that attend those after-school staff circles are starting to hold more circles in their classrooms with their students because they're directly experiencing the benefit of what it's like to be part of a community building circle. I think any sort of community building among staff, like whether that means, you know, your typical happy hour after school on Friday, or maybe a staff potluck where everybody brings different recipes and all eat together. We see a lot of schools doing staff competitions, like a flag football contest on a professional development day, regular organized events that promote educator self-care. One of the schools I'm working with started hosting a yoga class after school on Tuesdays. They're a school that serves a really hard to serve population, and it's a school that's experienced a lot of turnaround in the last couple of years, and they're really starting to build community from scratch by holding these after school yoga sessions. Staff celebrations and appreciation whenever possible. This might be formal award ceremonies. This might just be staff shout outs. A couple schools I work with at the end of the week just send a list of shout outs of things they've noticed happening around the school building, and other staff members and students can add to that list. And so by Friday it's a couple page long list, and everybody's hunting through to see if, like, did the shout out I send get in here, and is my name in here, did I get shouted out for anything? And then finally, whenever possible, if you are able to provide extra pay for your educators, we've been really fortunate recently in DPS to get a small grant, and we're working with a cohort of 15 schools, for example, and when those 15 schools, that we're encouraging them to hold more after-school family engagement events and really transform the way they're doing, like, their Saturday detentions into more of a Saturday school with certified teachers and counselors there to provide supports to students. And so how can we make sure that when we can and when it's possible that we're actually paying our teachers and our staff members for the time that they're spending outside of the school day to really engage with families and students in a meaningful way? I think one thing that's also really important to making sure that your staff buys into restorative practices and owns restorative practices is making sure they feel like they have the time and the space to bring up any concerns that they're having around this work. And then I also think that not just concerns, but that they get to share their ideas and feel like they have input in school culture. And so one of the strongest examples that I can think of this is one of the middle schools that I work with has a manual that they call their Prevention and Intervention Manual. And in that manual, they have written down and documented every single school-wide policy, from how students enter in from recess, to if students are allowed to carry backpacks, to cell phone usage, every sort of after-school program that's involved in the school. And they have it broken down from kind of mirroring the MTSS practices of what kind of universal supports do we have in place that are available to every student and are provided to every student in this building. And then what kind of supports do we provide to a student when those weren't enough? So what are the first interventions that we use? And then what are those more intensive interventions? Like if we need to send a student to outside of school counseling, what are the resources that we use and what is the protocol that we use to refer that family to those services? And what they do is every summer they meet as a staff, and these meetings are completely optional and they are not paid, but they spend Monday evenings from 4 p.m. to 8 p.m. sitting in the social worker's backyard, having a barbecue, and talking about how these systems and structures worked last year and refining them for the following year. And so what they found is because there's just open invitation for staff to participate in creating these policies and refining these policies, that staff is a lot more bought into them from the get-go, because they felt like they had a voice, and if it's something they were unhappy with, they could have gone to that meeting and shared that concern. And they may have gone to that meeting and shared a concern. It might not have been changed, but at least they had a conversation with their fellow staff members about why that wasn't a possibility. I think inviting teachers to sit in on behavior team meetings, I think a lot of the pushback that we see in school buildings is a lack of understanding about what is happening with the restorative process. You know, that student had to leave my room, and then what happened with them outside of my classroom that ended with them back in my classroom. And so I think if teachers can just have a little insight to what's happening at the admin level or behavior team level, it could really help teachers understand how this process works and give them a say in maybe if they think that there should be changes to the supports that administrators and a behavior team is providing. I think as many avenues for feedback for educators as possible, the better. Maybe if there's like an online form that teachers can fill out if they have a concern or if they think something is going really well. Maybe there's a standing meeting that the teachers could attend. Maybe this is done in conjunction with a staff after school circle. Maybe the circle is about how are you feeling about our building culture at this moment, or how are you feeling about the way conflict and behavior is addressed in our building. And then finally, a non-critical space to troubleshoot concerns. I think if our educators are afraid to bring up behavior concerns to the attentions of others in the building, then we've really failed them. And so how can we make sure that we've created a non-critical space where they can walk in and share some of the concerns that they're having maybe with a student or with some of the practices and policies of the building? One suggestion that I have for this is potentially using protocols, and there are a handful of them that exist, and it's a resource that Dwana and I can certainly share with you. But there are protocols that exist that give you a structure for how you might talk about concerns in a way that both benefits the person who has the concern and benefits everybody else that's in that space listening to the concern, and they might be able to walk away with a new insight as well. And so typically those protocols are timed, and so maybe if I have a concern about a student in my classroom, I would have 5 minutes to share my concern, And then the people who I'm sharing with would have 5 minutes to ask clarifying questions. And then we might decide to spend 10 minutes coming up with talking about the root cause, and another 10 minutes coming up with solutions. And so if you have those kind of timed pieces, it really helps avoid those places, those non-critical spaces, becoming just a complaining session where no one ever walks away with, one, any ideas about how to fix their concern, but two, any ideas about how this might apply to things that are happening in their classroom if they weren't the person to raise the concern. And so the last thing that I think is just so important is really taking the time to highlight successes that are happening in your building. And that could be a couple different things. It might be looking at an educator and student relationship that went from sour to sweet over the course of a month after working through like multiple restorative conversations. It might be a student or an educator that has shown that they've demonstrated a new skill or really refined a new skill. It might be a new positive outlook, or it might just be a good day. I think a lot of times when we're in school buildings, we hear a lot about high flyers or frequent flyers, those students that keep popping up on the radar. How can we make sure that when we're talking about those students, we're also talking about the times where like he made it through a whole day sitting in all of his classes, and that's something that's really hard for him. And so really making sure that we figure out ways to celebrate those successes. I think there are a couple different ways that you can do that. I've seen it done through, a student of the week or an educator of the week. I think just sharing those stories at professional development can be really powerful. Or just really making sure that you celebrate it to the person who is part of that transformed relationship, and recognizing that like we really see the progress that you and that student have made over the course of the last month. And I think part of celebrating successes also means that we really need to make sure that we're also acknowledging the skill set that educators in our building already have. And how do we take advantage of the expertise that already exists in our building? That might be having educators share their best relationship building strategy when they're in a team meeting. I can speak to times that really helped me, especially if I was new in a school and teaching there for the first time and trying to figure out how to navigate this new student population or a new city. It was always really helpful for me if other educators shared, people love the Denver Broncos, really talk to our students about the Broncos, and that's a great way to start to reach our students. And then finally, having educators observe one another. So if you have an educator who you think is practicing like particularly strong affective statements, and you have a teacher that's struggling, create the time and the space where they can actually go in and observe one of their colleagues. Because not only does that go back to creating the time and space to actually practice this work, but it also goes back to celebrating the success that that educator has. And you can imagine how empowering that would be if you're the teacher who they're sending other teachers in to observe because you've really mastered a certain aspect of restorative justice practices.
Great. Thank you so much, Allison. I learned a whole lot from listening to you, especially some of the real life experiences that you shared. And so now if there are any questions, there are a couple ways to do this. You can, if you're on your computer, you can type your questions into the box, or you can type into the chat. I think you can also do this if you're calling in if you're using like a smartphone and you use the app, or you could raise your hand. I can try to unmute folks, but in the past that hasn't worked broadly. So we'll try those strategies first. Either type into the chat or type in your questions, and we will get those answered first. And I see we do have a question. What would be the first steps for staff implementation after they have received an initial training?
Do you want to answer this one, or do you want me to go for it?
You can do it.
So one thing that I've seen, especially if a school is very early on, is one of the most successful ways to start is to start using restorative practices with your staff. I think the training is one thing as far as understanding where this work is coming from and understanding what some of the practices are themselves. And I just think that once somebody's really experienced what it's like to sit in a community building circle, or what it's like to have conflict mediated in in a way that is restorative, I think that's usually the best selling point for why we should be doing this work with our students. And so I worked with a couple buildings that felt like, you know, how do I start? And I always suggested, like, I would start with that first circle with your staff, and I think that's the way to really get ownership from them.
Yeah, definitely. I know, like in our trainings, we definitely encourage people to start with the staff first, because once they feel it, and I think Allison spoke to this in her remarks. You know, once educators and the adults feel it and they see it's working for them, and they are more likely to use it with their young people. Okay, we have another question. What are the different ways to provide training when PD hours aren't always available? This is a question we get a lot. So Allison, did you want to start? Do you want me to start?
I can start. We're actually running into this issue right now. We're trying to get a lot of the schools that are in this small cohort with us to allocate professional development time, and you know that calendar was decided last March, and so it's really hard to get into that calendar. And so one thing we're finding is, if we look at that calendar, we can maybe figure out a couple of the things that they're covering that might fit into that category I was talking about, that's complementary PD. And so they might have already allocated a day to talking about trauma-informed care, and there's a way where we can make that about trauma-informed care and restorative justice practices. And then I would say one of the other tools that we're using is, if we can't get the whole group PD time, how can I maybe come in and work with your 9th grade teacher team when they meet? Or how could I come in and work with your teacher instructional coaches so that they're disseminating that information as they're in the classroom coaching teachers?
Yeah, and I think, you know, some of the other ways that we've also been able to do that, I know Allison spoke about this just in terms of, you know, sometimes staff being able and being willing to give up their weekends. We have also seen staff give up their weekends. You know, we're doing monthly trainings, and we never had a shortage of staff. And sometimes those trainings had to straddle a Saturday and Sunday, but we found that folks who are really committed to this work, they often make time, and they will give up their personal time also to make it work as well. Some of the other strategies that we've used is to also look, you know, not just at the school district's calendar and the school's calendar, but also partnering with teachers unions has been really successful. So we've been able to, you know, do a training through the union, and the union has a set number, typically has a set number of professional development days as well that they can also use. And sometimes they can provide substitutes for educators. And so, you know, being creative just in also terms of partnerships and who you're working with to be able to provide some training. Okay, next question. What are some examples of sentence stems for having constructive, growth-minded conversations with challenging students?
Sure. So one thing that I've been working with is developing a list of questions that staff can answer about each student. And so anytime like a student of concern comes up, like what are the questions that lead that conversation? And that's a resource that I can share with Dwana, so she can send it out to everybody with the recording of the webinar. And then as far as sentence stems, I'm trying to pull up the document right now. But I would just focus on one, addressing the root cause of a behavior rather than just the behavior itself. I would definitely encourage anything you can do to separate the student from the behavior. And so like a student is never seen as bad. And then making sure that that conversation always ends with a solution. What is the intervention that we're going to try? How long are we going to try it for? Who is going to support this student in the process? But I do have a couple resources that I can send to Dwana and we can share with everybody.
Thanks. And we do have, just so people know, I know, Michelle, you've asked a couple of times, and we are recording the webinar, and so we will send along a copy of the webinar along with the resources that Allison mentioned afterwards. Okay. Are there any other questions? Allison, were there any other? And this was different from the last one, and so I cannot unmute folks. We cannot unmute everyone broadly, unfortunately, with this service. And so you either have to type it into the box or into the chat or raise your hand. Oh, but we did get another question. What's a good example of a teacher adding a restorative lens to their lesson plan? Okay, I think Allison is muted. While we try to work that off, I think, Allison, I think you have to, you should be able to unmute yourself now.
Yes,
okay.
I can. I think there's a couple different ways. I think it could be the content of your lesson, or it could also be the structure of your lesson. I can think about, you know, for example, reading or any literacy teachers, they might choose to let students choose the book that they want to read. And you might also make sure that you have books that are reflections of your students. And so if you're teaching a very diverse student population, you want books that speak to the students that are in that room. And so when they get to pick a book, they can pick one that really speaks to their story and something that they would be able to make, you know, text to self connections with. I also think that you can do it in lesson structure. Some of my colleagues from teaching high school would always say, you know, you have it easy, you teach social studies. What about those of us that teach math? How am I supposed to, you know, connect to my students through my content? But I had a lot of teachers that would make sure that they built into their class time a lot of times where students were engaging it with manipulatives or some sort of like hands-on game and interacting with their classmates, just because it provided time for the teacher to not only go around and provide academic support, but to stop and talk to the kids and ask them how the day is going, or how, you know, the football game was over the weekend, and really be able to relate to the students on a personal basis. So I think it can be both the content, but it can also be the structure of the lesson of itself that allows time for relationship building.
Yeah, and I think we also know teachers that, you know, teach in circle, for example, and so teachers who may have, let's say they're giving out a book report, and they used to do that book report where all the students would report back, you know, individually. Now they do that in circle. So just ways, also thinking of ways to incorporate circle and just your everyday instruction as well. So we do have Aline raised her hand, and so Aline, you should be unmuted now if you have a question.
Yes, how do you build in a willingness to be embarrassed, to try out these new processes with staff, and making it a fun thing of, we're going to go explore this and we're not ashamed to make mistakes?
I think that's the same skill in a lot of ways we're trying to build in our students, is this this comfort level of being okay with taking risks and being okay with failing. And I think so much of that is just when you're training your staff, emphasizing that piece of like, what we're doing with our students is we're trying to teach them new skills, and we're asking them to practice them, and it's going to be messy, and we're asking them to be vulnerable. And so we're going to give you the same grace that we're going to give our students. And so if you want to try something new, like, I promise that you won't be reprimanded for it. But I get what you're asking. It is a hard thing to instill in staff, especially when if they have been in a culture where they felt, you know, hyper criticized rather than supported in trying new things.
Thank you.
I think that's also what makes like Restorative Justice unique, is that it is very different from how we, you know, typically do instruction or how we operate with each other in school communities. And so, you know, just having grace in general with yourself, with others. I think everyone I know who does this work has their own stories about how they have made their own mistakes, and, you know, not being afraid to share that with folks. So even in trainings or in conversations, I mean, you could do a circle just on, you know, some of the things you learned while keeping circles, right? So people understand that it is something where, just like everything, you get better with time. The more you do it, the better you become at it. But to always treat yourself with grace. It is a very important role to have. but you know, we have all been there, all made mistakes sometimes, but all gotten better because of it.
Thank you.
Okay, Allison. So I don't see any more hands raised, and I don't see any more questions in the box. So just like we opened the circle or opened this webinar, Allison, unless you had anything else to add, we are also going to close it with a reading as well.
Right. So this reading comes from the book The Last Lecture by Randy Pausch, who so it's tradition among professors that you might be asked to give the last lecture, and the idea is that you're sharing what would be the last lecture that you would give to your students if you knew that it was the final one you would ever give. And in Randy Pausch's case, he had terminal cancer, and so this was in fact the last lecture that he would give. And in it, he included a lot of life lessons that he had learned from his time as a professor and working with students. And so I specifically chose this reading just because it talks a little bit about reciprocity. We need to make sure that if we're asking our staff to do this difficult work, that we're doing something for them as well. And so this reading is called Send Out Thin Mints. As part of my responsibilities, I used to be an academic reviewer. That meant I'd have to ask other professors to read densely written research papers and review them. It could be tedious and sleep-inducing work. So I came up with an idea. I'd send a box of Girl Scout Thin Mints with every paper that needed to be reviewed. Thank you for agreeing to do this, I'd write. The enclosed Thin Mints are your reward, but no fair eating them until you review the paper. That put a smile on people's faces, and I never had to call and nag them. They had the box of Thin Mints on their desk. They knew what they had to do. Sure, sometimes I had to send a reminder email, but when I'd ping people, all I needed was one sentence. Did you eat the Thin Mints yet? I found Thin Mints are a great communication tool. They're also a sweet reward for a job well done.
Thank you so much, Allison. And just thank you again for all of you who joined us this evening. We will send out the recording of this webinar along with the resources that Allison mentioned. You can also go to our website, which is denverrpp.org, and there you can find our implementation guide. You can find our implementation guide, and then you can also find some other resources that we have for educators, for students, for families. You can also go on there to look at our school visit schedule and sign up for a school visit. Again, NEA is organizing a couple of these visits this year, but these visits are free and open to anyone to attend at any point of the year, just based on the calendar. You can also feel free to email us with any questions that you may have. Our email address is located in the webinar instructions. You'll also get an email from Allison and I, and so you can just respond to us with additional questions. We do have one question about RJ-based readings that we like. I think Allison and I both use Circle Forward. I carry that book with me everywhere I go. To do several circles. It is incredibly helpful, not just about keeping circles and sample icebreakers, sample openings and closings, the history of restorative justice, how you can infuse trauma-informed care. I have found a lot of great information out of that book. I also really like the Little Book series. And so there's the Little Book of Restorative Justice and Education, the Little Book of Restorative Justice. There's a little book of circle keeping. You can find those on Amazon. They're really cheap, about $5 to $8 a book, and very easy reads. But give you a lot of information. Allison, are there any other books that you like about RJ?
Actually, I have two in particular. Middle school that I work with that has seen a lot of success with staff buy-in did as a school-wide book study. The book is called Better Than Carrots or Sticks. And it's just a very practical look at how you can apply restorative justice practices to a classroom or school-wide. And one of my favorite parts about it is for each element that they talk about, they include student testimonials about how that made them feel. And so it's a really hard sell for teachers, since it's just specifically talking about how this practice can serve students. And then the second one I would recommend is Touching Spirit Bear. And that is a novel that talks about a student, an Indigenous youth that went through the restorative process, and it's really how steeped in tradition it is in Indigenous cultures. But one of my favorite things about that is it's a young adult novel, and so I've seen a couple of the middle schools and high schools here in Denver actually have their students read it as well. And that, for some of the principals that I work with, that was the book that really changed their frame of mind.
And we will also, what we can also do in our email is include a list of these books that we've just referenced for you all to look at. And again, the address, the website of the partnership is denverrpp.org. So like Denver Restorative Practices Partnership.org.
Oh, actually, Dwana, there's only one P. It's denverrp.
There is only one P. Thank you, Allison.
No problem.
denverrp.org, denverrp.org. But if you have, again, if you have any questions or need to be directed there, any additional resources, you can feel free to reach out anytime. Okay, with that, just thank you again, everyone, for joining us, and have a wonderful evening.
Thanks, Dwana.
Thanks, Allison.